When blacksmith Marcus Thorne's disfigured face drives an entire town to look away in disgust, he believes his heart died in the same fire that destroyed his family, until a fearless schoolteacher touches his scarred cheek without flinching. But as their forbidden love grows stronger, a vengeful enemy from her past arrives to tear them apart. Can two broken souls find sanctuary in each other's arms, or will their scars prove too deep to heal? Marcus Thorne's hammer crashed down on red-hot steel, sending orange sparks flying like angry fireflies in the dim Kansas morning. The rhythmic pounding echoed through Millbrook's dusty main street, where folks hurried past his blacksmith shop without so much as a sideways glance. That's how Marcus preferred it. Invisible, forgotten, safe behind the shadows of his forge. The left side of his face told a story nobody wanted to hear. Twisted flesh, angry red scars, and an eye clouded white as winter milk marked him as different in a town where different meant dangerous. 3 years had passed since the fire took everything. His wife Elizabeth, his little girl Mary, and the man he used to be. Now he existed somewhere between the living and the dead, hammering horseshoes and mending wagon wheels for people who paid quickly and left quicker. "Easy there, Thunder," Marcus whispered to the massive black stallion tied outside his shop. The horse belonged to traveling merchant Jake Sullivan, a man who treated Marcus decent enough but never looked directly at his damaged face. Thunder stomped nervously, ears twitching at every sound from the busy street beyond. Millbrook was growing. New families arrived each week, drawn by promises of fertile land and fresh starts. Marcus watched them through his shop window, hopeful faces filled with dreams of better tomorrows. He remembered having dreams once, before the flames stole them away along with everything else he'd held dear. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the September air thick and heavy. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow with a grimy cloth, careful to avoid touching the scarred tissue that pulled tight whenever he moved too quickly. Dr. Morrison had done his best 3 years ago, but some wounds run too deep for medicine to reach. Children's laughter drifted from the new schoolhouse down the street, where Miss Hayes was teaching her students about arithmetic and reading. Marcus had heard good things about the young teacher. How she traveled all the way from Missouri with nothing but a worn carpet bag and enough books to stock a small library. Brave woman coming west alone like that. Most ladies wouldn't dare make such a journey without a husband to protect them. A commotion outside made Thunder rear up on his hind legs, pulling against the hitching post with frightened whinnies. Marcus dropped his hammer and rushed outside to see what had spooked the animal. Down the street, a runaway wagon careened wildly toward the marketplace. Its young driver couldn't be more than 8 years old, clinging desperately to leather reins as two panic-stricken horses bolted forward. Time slowed to a crawl. Marcus saw Mrs. Peterson pushing her baby carriage directly into the wagon's path. Mr. Chun was unloading supplies from his general store, completely unaware of the approaching danger. Several townsfolk scattered like startled chickens, but nobody moved to stop the runaway team. Marcus ran faster than he had in years, his powerful legs carrying him across the dusty street in long strides. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he leaped onto the wagon's side rail, hauling himself up beside the terrified boy. The leather reins burned his palms as he fought to control the spooked animals, pulling back with all his strength while speaking in low, calm tones. "Whoa there, easy now," he called to the horses, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The wagon lurched violently to the left, then the right, before finally sliding to a stop just inches from Mrs. Peterson's carriage. Marcus helped the shaking boy down from the driver's seat, checking him for injuries while a crowd gathered around them. The child was scared but unhurt, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks as he clung to Marcus's shirt. "Thank you, mister," the boy whispered. "I thought I was gonna die for sure." "You're safe now, son," Marcus replied gently, kneeling down to meet the child's eyes. "That was some brave driving you did there." But as Marcus stood up, he became aware of the crowd watching him. Their faces showed the same mix of emotions he'd grown accustomed to over the years: gratitude for his heroic actions, but disgust at his appearance. Several people looked away when he turned toward them, while others whispered behind cupped hands. "Good thing the beast was useful for something," someone muttered from the back of the crowd, followed by nervous laughter that cut through Marcus like a knife. The familiar shame crept up his neck, hot and suffocating. He started to turn away, to retreat back to the safety of his forge where nobody had to look at him, when something made him pause. A pair of steady blue eyes hadn't looked away. "That was the bravest thing I've witnessed since arriving in Millbrook." The voice belonged to a woman in a simple brown traveling dress, her dark hair pinned back beneath a faded bonnet that had seen better days. She stepped forward with confident movements while everyone else maintained their careful distance from Marcus. "Just did what needed doing?" Marcus mumbled, turning his face away so she couldn't see the worst of his scars. Most women screamed when they got a good look at him. Some fainted. This one didn't seem like the fainting type, but he'd learned not to take chances. "Wait, please." Her hand touched his arm gently, and Marcus froze. Nobody had touched him willingly since the fire, not even Dr. Morrison unless it was absolutely necessary for medical reasons. "I'm Catherine Hayes. I teach at the schoolhouse." Marcus risked a glance at her face. She was looking directly at him, not at the ground or over his shoulder like most folks did. Her expression held no pity, no disgust, just honest curiosity and something that might have been respect. "Marcus Thorne," he said quietly. "I run the smithy down the street. I know who you are." Catherine's voice carried no judgment, just simple acceptance of facts. "I was hoping you might have time to look at my wagon wheel. It's been wobbling something fierce since I arrived from Independence 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. Marcus had been aware of the new schoolteacher's arrival, of course. News traveled fast in a town the size of Millbrook. But he'd kept his distance, same as always. Teachers were educated people, refined folks who expected better company than a scarred blacksmith could provide. "I suppose I could take a look?" Marcus heard himself saying, surprised by his own words. Catherine led him to a modest wagon parked behind the schoolhouse, chatting easily as they walked. She told him about her journey west, the challenges of getting children excited about learning, and her plans to start a lending library once she'd saved enough money for more books. Her natural way of talking began to chip away at the walls Marcus had built around himself, though he remained mostly silent, answering only when she asked direct questions. The wagon wheel indeed needed attention. The iron rim had worked loose from the wooden spokes, creating a dangerous wobble that could snap the axle if left untreated. Marcus knelt down to examine the problem more closely, running his hands along the metal surface to check for cracks or weak spots. "You have gentle hands," Catherine observed, causing Marcus to look up sharply. "Most folks would disagree with that opinion," he said, his voice carrying 3 years of bitter experience. "Most folks see what they expect to see," Catherine replied calmly. "I prefer to see what's actually there." Their eyes met for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Marcus felt something stir inside his chest, a warmth he'd thought buried forever beneath layers of grief and shame. It scared him more than any runaway wagon ever could. "This will take a couple hours to fix properly," he said, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. "I'll need to remove the wheel and reset the rim in my forge." "How much will it cost?" Catherine asked, reaching for a small purse tied to her belt. Marcus waved away her money. "No charge. Consider it payment for being the only person in this town who doesn't look at me like I'm some kind of monster." Catherine's expression grew serious. "You're not a monster, Mr. Thorne. You're a man who's been through something terrible and survived. That takes courage, not monstrous behavior." Her words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Nobody had called him courageous since before the fire. Most days, he felt like a coward for continuing to live when his family hadn't been given that choice. "I'll bring your wagon by the shop this afternoon," he managed to say. "Should have it ready by evening." "Thank you," Catherine said simply. "I'll walk over around supper time to collect it." As Marcus headed back to his forge, he found himself thinking about Catherine Hayes in ways that made him uncomfortable. She was educated, well-spoken, probably came from a good family back in Missouri. What could a woman like that possibly want with a broken-down blacksmith whose own reflection made him sick to his stomach? But she'd looked at him, really looked at him, without flinching. She called him brave, and her touch on his arm had felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Marcus spent the afternoon working on Catherine's wagon wheel with unusual care, making sure every detail was perfect. He told himself it was just professional pride, but deep down he knew better. He wanted to give her something beautiful, something that would make her smile the way she'd smiled when she called him courageous. As the sun began to set over the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus found himself watching the street for Catherine's approach. When she finally appeared in his doorway, silhouetted against the dying light, his heart did something it hadn't done in 3 long years. It hoped. Catherine Hayes carried a steaming pot of beef stew through Millbrook's empty streets, her boots crunching on fallen leaves that October had scattered like copper coins. The warm food wasn't really for Marcus Thorne. She'd cooked enough for 1 person, not 2. But something about the lonely blacksmith made her want to share what little comfort she could offer. 3 weeks had passed since he'd fixed her wagon wheel, and Catherine found herself inventing reasons to visit his forge. A loose horseshoe on her mare, a broken door hinge that needed mending. Each time, she stayed a little longer, talking about her students while Marcus worked with his powerful hands, shaping metal into useful things. The forge glowed orange in the gathering dusk, and Catherine could see Marcus silhouetted against the fire like some ancient god of iron and flame. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his scarred features before settling into something that might have been pleasure. "Evening, Miss Hayes," he said, setting down his hammer. "What brings you by so late?" "I made too much supper again," Catherine lied easily, holding up the pot. "Thought you might help me finish it before it spoils." Marcus wiped his hands on a leather apron, leaving dark smudges across the worn material. "That's kind of you, but I don't want to be any trouble." "The only trouble would be letting good food go to waste," Catherine replied, already moving toward the small table where Marcus ate his solitary meals. "Besides, I could use the company." They sat across from each other in the flickering firelight, sharing the hearty stew while conversation flowed easier than either had expected. Catherine told him about young Tommy Fletcher, who couldn't sit still long enough to learn his letters, and Marcus shared memories of his early days as an apprentice blacksmith in Ohio. "Why did you come west?" Marcus asked, accepting a second helping of stew. "Seems like a dangerous journey for a woman traveling alone." Catherine was quiet for a moment, stirring her food without eating. "Sometimes staying in one place becomes more dangerous than leaving," she said finally. "Sometimes you have to run toward uncertainty instead of hiding from it." Marcus nodded, understanding more than she realized. "I used to think about leaving Millbrook after the fire. Figured maybe somewhere else people wouldn't know what happened. Wouldn't look at me like I was something broken that needed fixing." "What stopped you?" "Fear, mostly." Marcus touched the scarred side of his face unconsciously. "Fear that I'd find the same thing everywhere I went. People who couldn't see past this." He gestured at his disfigured features. "At least here, I know what to expect." Catherine reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The simple touch sent electricity up Marcus's arm, making him flinch in surprise. Nobody had touched him gently since Elizabeth died, and the sensation was almost overwhelming. "Maybe the problem isn't how other people see you," Catherine said softly. "Maybe it's how you see yourself." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their quiet moment. Catherine pulled her hand away quickly, suddenly aware of how their evening together might look to others. In a small town like Millbrook, unmarried men and women didn't share private meals without causing gossip. Sheriff Tom Walsh appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. Behind him stood Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, and Dr. Morrison, their expressions serious in the firelight. "Evening, Marcus." "Miss Hayes." Walsh touched the brim of his hat politely. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got ourselves a situation that needs discussing." Marcus stood up, instantly alert. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that involves strangers asking questions about our new schoolteacher," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight with worry. "3 men rode into town this afternoon, claiming to be looking for a woman who matches Miss Hayes' description exactly." Catherine went pale, her hands trembling as she set down her spoon. "What did these men look like?" "Well-dressed. expensive horses. The leader had cold eyes and talked like he owned the world. Dr. Morrison replied. They're staying at the hotel. Paying in gold coins like money means nothing to them. Did they give their names? Catherine asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. The leader called himself Richard Blackwood, Sheriff Walsh said. Said he was tracking a woman who stole something valuable from him back in Missouri. Claims she's dangerous and not to be trusted. Marcus watched Catherine's face crumble as if she'd been struck. Her whole body began to shake, and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was trying to hold her pieces together. Catherine. Marcus moved closer, wanting to comfort her but uncertain how. Do you know these men? Richard Blackwood was my fiancé, Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. And he's absolutely right about one thing. I did steal something from him. Something he'll kill to get back. The four visitors exchanged glances, understanding that their quiet evening had just taken a turn toward real danger. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the forge's windows and carrying with it the scent of approaching storm. Miss Hayes, Sheriff Walsh said gently, I think you'd better tell us everything. Richard Blackwood destroyed my father and killed him as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. Catherine's voice carried across the sheriff's office like ice water, each word dropping into the silence with deadly precision. The five adults gathered around Walsh's desk looked like they were planning for war instead of discussing a woman's past. Marcus sat beside Catherine, close enough to offer support but careful not to touch her in front of the others. He could see the terror in her eyes, the way her hands shook every time she mentioned Blackwood's name. Whatever this man had done to her went deeper than simple heartbreak. Start from the beginning, Sheriff Walsh said, pouring coffee for everyone from a dented pot that had seen better days. Help us understand what we're dealing with. Catherine accepted the steaming cup gratefully, wrapping her fingers around it like it could anchor her to the present moment. My father owned the Farmers' Bank in Independence. Richard was his business partner. Charming, successful, everything a young woman was supposed to want in a husband. She paused, staring into the dark coffee as if it held answers to questions she'd been afraid to ask. Father trusted him completely. So did I. Richard courted me properly, bringing flowers and books, talking about our future together. He seemed perfect. But he wasn't, Dr. Morrison said quietly. No, he was stealing from the bank, using his position and father's trust to embezzle thousands of dollars over several years. I discovered it by accident. Found papers in his coat pocket when I was mending a torn seam. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued. Ledgers showing false transactions. Letters proving he'd been selling worthless land to farmers, taking their life savings for property that didn't exist. Marcus felt anger building in his chest like heat from his forge. What did you do? I confronted him, demanded he return the money and confess to father. Catherine laughed bitterly. Richard just smiled and told me I was going to marry him whether I liked it or not. Said if I ever breathed a word about what I'd found, he'd make sure father went to prison for crimes Richard had committed. Mrs. Henderson gasped. The man threatened you? He did more than threaten. When I refused to keep quiet, Richard went to the bank examiners first. He blamed everything on father, claimed my poor old dad was the one stealing money to pay for his daughter's expensive tastes. Tears ran down Catherine's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Father was arrested, ruined, driven from the only home he'd ever known. The shame killed him within 6 months. Sheriff Walsh leaned forward. And the evidence you mentioned? Catherine reached into her traveling bag and pulled out a leather portfolio tied with string. I managed to steal these before Richard could destroy them. Bank records, correspondence, proof of everything he really did. It's all here. Why didn't you take this to the authorities? Dr. Morrison asked. I tried, but Richard had already poisoned everyone against my family. Who would believe the word of a dead embezzler's daughter against a respected businessman with powerful friends? Catherine's hands clenched into fists. So I ran. Changed my name from Catherine Morgan to Catherine Hayes and came west, hoping to disappear. Marcus touched her shoulder gently. But he found you anyway. Richard never forgives, and he never forgets. He spent 2 years tracking me down, and now he's here. Catherine looked up at the sheriff. Those men didn't come to Millbrook by accident. They know exactly who I am and where to find me. The office fell silent except for the ticking of Walsh's old clock and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, turning the late afternoon sky dark as midnight. What does he want? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The evidence I stole, and probably revenge for making him chase me across half the country. Catherine stood up and began pacing like a caged animal. Richard can't afford to let me live knowing what I know. Too many people might start asking uncomfortable questions about Father's case. Sheriff Walsh drummed his fingers on the desk, thinking hard. My authority doesn't extend to crimes committed in Missouri, but I can protect you while you're in my town. The question is, what do we do about Blackwood and his men? We could send word to the Missouri authorities, Mrs. Henderson suggested. Let them know where to find him. By the time help arrives from Missouri, Catherine could be dead, Marcus said bluntly. Or worse, Blackwood could disappear with her, and we'd never see either of them again. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began pattering against the office windows. The storm was moving in fast, just like the danger that had followed Catherine across the plains. There might be another way, Dr. Morrison said slowly, but it would require Miss Hayes to take a considerable risk. All eyes turned to him. What kind of risk? The kind that could either free you from Richard Blackwood forever, the doctor replied, or get you killed trying. Catherine stopped pacing and looked directly at Marcus, searching his scarred face for something she couldn't name. When their eyes met, she saw not the damaged man the world perceived, but someone who understood what it meant to survive when everything seemed lost. Tell me what you're thinking, she said firmly. I'm tired of running. Richard Blackwood's polished boots clicked across the hotel's wooden floor like a death march, each step echoing through the small lobby where nervous townspeople pretended not to stare. His expensive suit and cold smile made him look like a snake dressed up for Sunday service, and everyone in Millbrook could sense the danger radiating from him like heat from a fire. Good morning, Richard said to the hotel clerk, his voice smooth as honey but twice as deadly. I believe you have information about a Miss Catherine Hayes who's been teaching at your local school. The young clerk, barely 18 and sweating despite the cool morning air, stammered his response. I don't know nothing about the schoolteacher, mister. Maybe you should talk to Sheriff Walsh. Oh, I intend to. Richard's smile never reached his eyes. But first, I thought I'd have a chat with some of the local citizens, get their thoughts on their beloved teacher. Meanwhile, across town in Catherine's small cabin behind the schoolhouse, she was stuffing her few belongings into a worn carpet bag with shaking hands. The plan Dr. Morrison had suggested seemed impossible now that morning had arrived, bringing with it the harsh reality of what they were attempting. Marcus watched her from the doorway, his heart breaking at the fear in her movements. You don't have to do this, Catherine. We could find another way. What other way? Catherine spun around, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Run again? Spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when Richard will appear? I'm tired of being afraid, Marcus. Tired of letting that man control my life. The plan was dangerous but simple. Catherine would make it appear that she was preparing to flee Millbrook, just as she'd fled Independence 2 years ago. She'd buy a ticket on the next stage heading west, make a show of selling her few possessions, and let word spread that she was running scared. Richard's arrogance would compel him to stop her before she could escape again, but this time they'd be ready. He'll come after you before the stage leaves, Marcus said, his voice heavy with worry. Richard won't risk losing you a second time. I'm counting on it. Catherine closed her bag and turned to face him fully. But Marcus, if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. Marcus stepped closer, taking her hands in his scarred ones. I won't let him hurt you. Catherine looked up into his damaged face and saw not the monster the world perceived, but the strongest, bravest man she'd ever known. Promise me something. If this plan fails, if Richard takes me away from here, don't try to follow. Don't throw your life away for someone like me. Someone like you? Marcus's voice was incredulous. Catherine, you're the best thing that's happened to this town. The best thing that's happened to me. I'd rather die fighting for you than live knowing I let you face this alone. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sheriff Walsh entered without waiting for permission, his expression grim. It's time. Blackwood's making his rounds, asking questions about you. Half the town's seen him by now. Catherine took a deep breath and picked up her bag. Then let's give him something to see. The three of them walked to the main street, where Catherine made a loud production of buying a stage ticket from the depot manager. She spoke clearly about her plans to travel to California, complained about the unsafe conditions in Millbrook, and generally acted like a woman desperate to escape. Several townspeople gathered to watch the show, and Catherine knew word would reach Richard within the hour. At the general store, she sold her extra books and winter clothing, claiming she needed traveling money. Mr. Chun played his part perfectly, expressing surprise and sadness at her sudden departure. Mrs. Henderson, despite her initial suspicions about Catherine's past, found herself genuinely moved by the young teacher's apparent distress. "Are you certain about this, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked quietly. "Surely whatever trouble you're facing, we can help you through it." Catherine's smile was sad but genuine. "Some troubles follow you wherever you go, Mrs. Henderson. Sometimes running is the only choice you have left." By noon, the entire town was buzzing with news of the schoolteacher's planned departure. Children from Catherine's class gathered outside the schoolhouse, some crying openly at the thought of losing their beloved teacher. Their genuine grief made Catherine's heart ache with guilt for the deception they were playing. Young Billy Peterson, Sheriff Walsh's deputy, took his position at the hotel where he could watch Richard's movements. Marcus returned to his forge but kept a loaded rifle hidden behind his anvil. Dr. Morrison made sure his medical supplies were ready, just in case the plan went wrong. The stage was scheduled to leave at 4 o'clock, and as the afternoon wore on, tension in Millbrook grew thick as summer honey. Catherine spent her last hours visiting students' families, saying goodbye to people who had become more than neighbors. They had become friends. At 3:30, she walked slowly toward the stage depot, her bag clutched tightly in one hand. The autumn air felt crisp against her face, and she could smell wood smoke from a dozen chimneys. In another life, she might have been happy to call this place home forever. Richard Blackwood stepped out from behind the bank building like a spider emerging from its web. He was flanked by two armed men, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. His smile was the same one she remembered from their engagement, charming on the surface, but cold as winter underneath. "Hello, Catherine," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Going somewhere?" "Richard." Catherine's voice stayed steady despite the terror clawing at her throat like a living thing. She stood perfectly still in the middle of Millbrook's main street, her carpet bag clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white as fresh snow. "You didn't really think you could run from me forever, did you?" Richard stepped closer, his expensive boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. 2 years I've been chasing you across this godforsaken country. 2 years of sleeping in dirty hotels and eating trail food while you played schoolteacher in this pathetic little town." From his position near the forge, Marcus could see everything unfolding exactly as they'd planned. Richard had taken the bait, approaching Catherine in broad daylight where witnesses could see his threatening behavior. But something felt wrong. The two gunmen with Richard looked more dangerous than they'd expected, their eyes constantly scanning the street for potential threats. "I have nothing to say to you," Catherine replied, taking a small step backward toward the stage depot. "Whatever you think I took, I don't have it anymore." "Oh, but you do." Richard's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that reminded Catherine of a wolf's fangs. "Those bank documents you stole are still out there somewhere, and I know you're too sentimental to destroy them. You probably think they're your father's only chance at redemption, don't you?" Deputy Billy Peterson watched from the hotel window, his young hands sweating as they gripped his rifle. He'd never been in a real gunfight before, and the responsibility of protecting Miss Hayes felt heavier than a mountain on his shoulders. Sheriff Walsh had positioned himself behind the barbershop, but Billy couldn't see him from his current angle. "My father was innocent," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You destroyed his reputation to cover your own crimes, and it killed him. The whole town knows the truth now, Richard. They know what kind of man you really are." Richard laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The whole town? You mean this collection of farmers and shopkeepers? Who's going to believe them against my word? I have friends in high places, Catherine. Important men who owe me favors. Maybe they won't believe us," a new voice said from behind Richard. Marcus stepped into the street, moving with the calm confidence of a man who'd made peace with whatever might happen next. "But they'll definitely believe the evidence Catherine's been carrying around." Richard spun to face this unexpected challenger, his eyes widening in disgust when he saw Marcus's scarred features. "And what might you be? The local freak show? I'm the man who's going to stop you from hurting her," Marcus replied evenly. His hands hung loose at his sides, but Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he'd positioned himself to move quickly if needed. "You?" Richard's laughter was genuinely amused now. "A burned-up blacksmith thinks he can threaten me? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the street. "You're a coward who steals from honest people and destroys innocent families. You're a man who's so afraid of being exposed that you'll chase a woman halfway across the country rather than face the consequences of your actions." The insult hit Richard like a physical slap. His face flushed red with anger, and his hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, monster." "Actually, I do." Sheriff Walsh stepped out from behind the barbershop, his own weapon drawn and ready. "Richard Blackwood, you're under arrest for threatening a citizen of this county." Richard's two gunmen immediately reached for their weapons, but Marcus was already moving. He tackled the nearest one around the waist, sending them both crashing into the dirt. The man's gun flew from his hand, spinning across the street like a deadly toy. Billy Peterson's rifle cracked from the hotel window, and the second gunman stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had found its mark. The young deputy's hands were shaking, but his aim had been true when it mattered most. In the chaos, Richard grabbed Catherine's arm and pulled her against him, his own pistol now pressed to her temple. "Everyone stay back, or the lady dies." The street fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whinny of spooked horses. Marcus slowly got to his feet, his eyes locked on Richard's face with an intensity that made the other man take an involuntary step backward. "Let her go," Marcus said quietly. "Your fight is with the law now, not with her." "My fight is with anyone who tries to stop me from getting what's mine," Richard snarled. "Catherine owes me for 2 years of trouble, and I intend to collect." "The only thing I owe you," Catherine said, her voice surprisingly calm despite the gun at her head, "is the truth about what you really are." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper, one of the bank documents she'd been carrying. "Sheriff Walsh, this shows how Richard Blackwood stole over $30,000 from my father's bank. There are 12 more documents just like it hidden in my cabin." Richard's grip on her arm tightened painfully. "You little fool. Do you think anyone cares about your dead father's reputation? He was weak, just like you." "No," Marcus said, stepping closer despite the gun pointed at Catherine's head. "She's the strongest person I've ever met. Strong enough to survive what you did to her family. Strong enough to start over in a place where nobody knew her name. Strong enough to stand up to you even when she's terrified." Something in Marcus's words seemed to reach Catherine, because she suddenly twisted away from Richard's grip with surprising force. The movement caught Richard off guard, and his shot went wide, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the side of Chen's general store. Marcus didn't hesitate. He charged forward like an angry bull, his powerful frame slamming into Richard and sending them both sprawling in the dusty street. They rolled and fought, Richard clawing at Marcus's scarred face while Marcus tried to pin the smaller man's arms. The struggle ended when Sheriff Walsh pressed his rifle barrel against Richard's temple. "That's enough. You're done." As the dust settled and Richard was hauled away in chains, Catherine found herself surrounded by concerned townspeople who no longer saw her as a stranger, but as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson fussed over her like a mother hen, while Dr. Morrison checked Marcus for injuries from the fight. "Is it really over?" Catherine asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It's over," Marcus assured her, pulling her into his arms despite the watching crowd. "You're safe now. We all are." But even as the people of Millbrook celebrated their victory, none of them noticed the lone rider watching from the hills outside town, one of Richard's associates who had stayed behind to observe the outcome of the confrontation. The man turned his horse and rode away into the gathering dusk, carrying news that would soon bring new dangers to their doorstep. Blood dripped steadily from Marcus's split lip onto the jailhouse floor as he sat beside Catherine, both of them staring at Richard Blackwood through the iron bars of Millbrook's single cell. The man who had terrorized Catherine for 2 years now looked smaller somehow, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his perfectly styled hair hanging in greasy strands across his forehead. "You think this is over?" Richard's voice carried a mocking tone that made Catherine's skin crawl. "You think putting me in this pathetic cage changes anything? I have friends, Catherine. Powerful men who don't forget their debts." Sheriff Walsh looked up from the telegram he was writing, his weathered fingers pausing over the paper. "Your friends can visit you in the Missouri State Prison, Blackwood. I'm sending word to the authorities there about your location." "Missouri's a long way from here," Richard said with a cold smile. "Lots of things can happen between now and when help arrives. Accidents, fires, people disappearing in the night." Marcus felt Catherine tense beside him, her hand seeking his for comfort. The past 3 days since Richard's capture should have brought relief, but instead they'd all felt like they were waiting for another storm to break. The townspeople had rallied around Catherine, offering support and protection, but everyone knew Richard Blackwood wasn't the type of man to accept defeat quietly. Dr. Morrison entered the jailhouse carrying his medical bag, his usually calm demeanor troubled. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you privately." Walsh set down his pen and followed the doctor outside, leaving Marcus and Catherine alone with their prisoner. Richard's presence filled the small space like poison, making normal conversation impossible. "Tell me about the scar," Richard said suddenly, his eyes fixed on Marcus's damaged face with cruel fascination. "How did it happen? Fire? Accident? Or did someone finally give you what you deserved?" Marcus didn't respond, but Catherine could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from his forge. She knew Richard was deliberately trying to hurt Marcus, to find the weak spots in his armor and tear them open. "I'm talking to you, monster," Richard continued, gripping the cell bars with white knuckles. "What kind of woman settles for damaged goods when she could have had perfection? Catherine always did have poor judgment." "That's enough," Catherine said firmly, standing up to face Richard directly. "You have no right to speak about Marcus that way." "I have every right," Richard sneered. "I was your fiancé. I was going to give you everything, wealth, status, a beautiful home. Instead, you chose this scarred freak who hammers metal for a living." Marcus started to rise from his chair, anger flashing in his good eye, but Catherine placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't let him bait you," she whispered. "He's trying to make you angry, so you'll do something foolish." Sheriff Walsh returned with Dr. Morrison, both men looking grim. "Marcus, Catherine, we need to talk outside." They stepped into the cool evening air, where the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. A group of townspeople had gathered near the general store, their hushed conversations and worried glances suggesting that news of some kind was spreading through Millbrook. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. Dr. Morrison opened his medical bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "Young Billy found this nailed to the church door about an hour ago." Catherine read the message aloud, her voice growing weaker with each word. "Release Richard Blackwood within 24 hours or face the consequences. The people of Millbrook have until sunset tomorrow to make their choice. Choose wisely." "There's more," Sheriff Walsh said grimly. "Mrs. Patterson saw riders on the hills east of town this afternoon. At least 6 men, maybe more, watching us through spyglasses. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Blackwood's reinforcements. Seems likely, Walsh agreed. The question is, what do we do about it? Catherine began pacing back and forth in front of the jailhouse, her mind racing through possibilities. How many fighting men do we have in town? Maybe a dozen, counting myself and Billy, Walsh replied. Most of the farmers don't have military experience, and some of our men are too old or too young to be much help in a real fight. Then we're outnumbered, Marcus said matter-of-factly. 6 professional gunmen against a handful of shopkeepers and farmers. It won't be much of a contest. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat nervously. There might be another option. We could consider releasing Blackwood. Let him leave with his men and hope they don't come back. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dead fire. Catherine stopped pacing and turned to face the doctor, her expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. You want me to let him go? After everything he's done? After he destroyed my father and threatened to kill me? Catherine's voice rose with each word. If we let Richard leave now, he'll just come back stronger. He'll never stop hunting me. But if we don't, Dr. Morrison said quietly, innocent people might die. Families, children. Is your revenge worth that price? Marcus stepped between Catherine and the doctor, his scarred face set in determined lines. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And it's about protecting someone I care about from a man who won't rest until she's dead. Noble words, a new voice said from the shadows. Richard's remaining gunman, the one who had escaped during the street fight, emerged from behind the barber shop with his weapon drawn. But you might want to reconsider your position. Behind him came 5 more armed men, all wearing the hard expressions of professional killers. They spread out in a line across the street, cutting off any escape routes. The leader, a tall man with a gray beard and cold eyes, stepped forward. Evening, folks, he said in a voice like gravel. Name's Wade Morrison. I'm here to collect my employer and settle some outstanding debts. Sheriff Walsh's hand moved slowly toward his gun, but Wade shook his head with mock sadness. I wouldn't try that, Sheriff. We've got men positioned all around your little town. One signal from me, and this place becomes a shooting gallery. Catherine felt her world collapsing around her again, just when she'd thought they were safe. What do you want? Simple transaction, Wade replied. You give us Blackwood, and we ride away peaceful-like. You refuse, and we take him anyway. But not before we burn this town to the ground and everyone in it. Young Billy Peterson appeared in the doorway of the hotel, his rifle aimed at Wade's back, but the gunman leader didn't seem concerned. Boy, you might want to look around before you do something you'll regret. Billy's face went pale as he spotted the gun barrels pointing at him from the shadows of nearby buildings. He was hopelessly outnumbered, surrounded by professional killers who could end his life before he could squeeze his trigger. Smart boy, Wade said approvingly. Now, what's it going to be, folks? Do we do this the easy way? Or do we paint the streets of Millbrook red tonight? Marcus looked at Catherine, seeing the fear and desperation in her eyes. She'd fought so hard to build a new life here, to find a place where she could belong. Now that sanctuary was being threatened by the same evil that had destroyed her family back in Missouri. There might be a third option, Marcus said slowly, an idea forming in his mind. Something none of you have considered. Wade's expression showed mild interest. I'm listening. Single combat, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. Me against your best man. Winner takes all. If I win, you leave Blackwood in jail and ride away forever. If your man wins, you can have him. Wade actually laughed at the suggestion. You? A scarred blacksmith against one of my boys? That's not much of a contest. Then you should have no problem accepting, Marcus replied calmly. Unless you're afraid of a little competition. The challenge hung between them like a drawn blade, while the people of Millbrook held their breath and waited to see which way their fate would fall. Dawn crept across the Kansas prairie like a wounded animal, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, while Marcus Thorne stood alone in the middle of Millbrook's main street. His scarred hands gripped a heavy sledgehammer, the same tool he'd used for years to shape iron into useful things, now transformed into a weapon of last resort. Across from him, Wade Morrison's chosen fighter rolled his massive shoulders and cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking bones. The man called himself Bull Mackenzie, and he looked like his nickname, 6.5 feet of solid muscle packed into a frame that seemed too large for any normal human being. Scars from old knife fights crisscrossed his arms, and his eyes held the cold emptiness of someone who killed for pleasure rather than profit. The rules were simple. No guns, no knives, just fists and whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Fight until one man couldn't continue. Winner determined the fate of everyone in Millbrook. Catherine stood with the other townspeople behind Sheriff Walsh's hastily drawn safety line, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to talk Marcus out of this insane plan, but he'd been stubborn as granite, insisting it was their only chance to save innocent lives. "He's twice your size," she'd whispered to him in the pre-dawn darkness. "Bull Mackenzie has killed men with his bare hands. This isn't a fair fight." "Fair fights are for people who have choices," Marcus had replied, touching her face gently with his work-roughened fingers. "I've lived with scars for 3 years, Catherine. I know how to fight through pain." Now, as the two men circled each other in the dusty street like predators seeking weakness, Catherine wondered if she was about to watch the man she loved die trying to protect her. Bull made the first move, charging forward with surprising speed for such a large man. His massive fist whistled through the air where Marcus's head had been a split second before, but the blacksmith had already rolled away, coming up with his hammer ready. "Stand still and fight like a man," Bull roared, his voice echoing off the buildings. "I am fighting like a man," Marcus replied calmly, dodging another wild swing. "A smart man." The crowd watched in tense silence as Marcus used his smaller size and greater agility to stay away from Bull's crushing blows. The big man's strategy was simple: use his reach and strength to overpower his opponent quickly. But Marcus had spent years working at a forge, building endurance and learning to move efficiently despite his injuries. Bull swung his meaty fist at Marcus's scarred face, but the blacksmith ducked low and brought his hammer up in a vicious arc. The heavy tool caught Bull in the ribs with a sickening crunch, and the giant stumbled backward, wheezing. "Lucky shot," Bull snarled, but his breathing was labored now. From her position behind the safety line, Catherine could see the calculation in Marcus's movements. He wasn't trying to match Bull's raw power. Instead, he was wearing the bigger man down, making him work for every attempted blow while conserving his own energy. Richard Blackwood pressed his face against the jail cell window, watching the fight with obvious glee. "Kill him," he shouted to Bull. "Crush that freak's skull." Sheriff Walsh turned away from the window in disgust. "Shut your mouth, Blackwood, or I'll gag you." Back in the street, Bull had managed to grab hold of Marcus's shirt, lifting the smaller man off his feet with terrifying ease. But Marcus didn't panic. Instead, he brought his knee up hard into Bull's stomach, then hammered the handle of his tool against the giant's temple when Bull doubled over in pain. Bull dropped Marcus and staggered backward, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. For the first time since the fight began, uncertainty flickered across his brutish features. "What's wrong, Bull?" Wade Morrison called from the sidelines. "Having trouble with a crippled blacksmith?" The taunt seemed to enrage Bull beyond reason. He let out a bellow like an angry bear and charged at Marcus with reckless abandon, no longer caring about strategy or self-preservation. His massive hands reached for Marcus's throat, intending to crush the life out of him with pure brute force. Marcus waited until Bull was almost on top of him, then spun aside at the last possible moment. Bull's momentum carried him forward into the side of Chen's general store with a thunderous crash that shook the entire building. Wooden boards splintered, and Bull slumped to the ground, dazed and bleeding. But the big man wasn't finished yet. He shook his head to clear it and slowly hauled himself back to his feet, his eyes now burning with murderous rage. "I'm gonna tear you apart piece by piece," he growled, spitting blood into the dust. Marcus was breathing hard now, sweat mixing with the dust on his scarred face. His left shoulder ached where Bull had grabbed him, and he could feel his energy beginning to fade. The fight had already lasted longer than he'd hoped, and Bull still looked capable of continuing for hours. "Give up now," Bull said, advancing slowly this time, more cautiously. "I'll make it quick if you surrender." "I don't surrender," Marcus replied, raising his hammer one more time. "Not when I'm fighting for something that matters." The two men came together in the center of the street like colliding storms. Bull's massive fist caught Marcus in the stomach, doubling him over with pain, but the blacksmith managed to bring his hammer down on Bull's foot with bone-crushing force. Bull howled in agony and hopped backward on one leg, giving Marcus the opening he needed. The hammer swept up in a perfect arc, catching Bull under the chin with every ounce of strength Marcus had left. The giant's eyes rolled back in his head, and he toppled backward like a felled tree, hitting the ground with an impact that seemed to shake the entire town. He didn't get up again. Wade Morrison stared at his fallen champion in disbelief, then slowly began to clap his hands. "Well, I'll be damned. Didn't think you had it in you, blacksmith." Marcus leaned heavily on his hammer, every muscle in his body screaming with exhaustion. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead, and his left eye was beginning to swell shut, but he was still standing. "A deal's a deal," Wade said, signaling to his men. "Boys, mount up. We're riding out." "What about Mr. Blackwood?" one of the gunmen asked. Wade looked toward the jail where Richard's face was pressed against the window, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Mr. Blackwood made his bed when he hired amateurs to do a professional's job. He can lie in it." As the gunman rode away into the morning sun, Catherine ran to Marcus and caught him as his legs finally gave out. They knelt together in the dusty street, holding each other while the people of Millbrook erupted in cheers around them. "It's over," Catherine whispered against his ear. "It's really over this time." Marcus looked up at her through his swollen eye and managed a tired smile. "No," he said softly. "It's just beginning." Sheriff Walsh approached them with a telegram in his hand, his weathered face creased in a rare smile. "This just came in from Missouri," he announced. "The authorities there are sending a federal marshal to collect Blackwood within the week. Seems they're very interested in those documents you saved, Miss Hayes." As the crowd began to disperse and normal life slowly returned to Millbrook, Marcus and Catherine remained kneeling in the street where they'd fought for their future together. The morning sun felt warm on their faces, and for the first time in years, both of them dared to hope that tomorrow might bring something better than yesterday's pain. But their moment of peace was interrupted by young Billy Peterson, who came running from the telegraph office with another message clutched in his trembling hands. "Sheriff," Billy called breathlessly, "you need to see this. It's about Miss Hayes, and it changes everything." Catherine's hands trembled like autumn leaves as she read the telegram that would change everything, her voice barely a whisper in the sudden silence of Sheriff Walsh's office. "The state of Missouri hereby declares the late banker Thomas Morgan innocent of all charges. Evidence provided by his daughter Catherine Morgan has resulted in the conviction of Richard Blackwood. All stolen funds have been recovered and returned to their rightful owners." Marcus watched tears stream down her face, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of a burden finally lifted after years of carrying unbearable weight. Her father's name had been cleared. The shame that had driven her from Missouri was gone, replaced by official recognition of his innocence. "There's more," Billy Peterson said breathlessly, still clutching additional telegrams that had arrived within minutes of each other. "This one's from the Farmers Bank in Independence. They want to offer you your father's old position, Miss Hayes. Full reinstatement with back pay and a formal apology from the board of directors." Sheriff Walsh leaned back in his creaky chair, a smile spreading across his weathered features. "Well, I'll be damned. Looks like justice finally caught up with the truth." Catherine sank into a wooden chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what these messages meant. After 2 years of running, of hiding, of building a new life under a false name, she was being offered the chance to return to everything she'd lost. Her father's reputation was restored. Her family's honor was intact. The life that Richard Blackwood had stolen from her was being handed back on a silver platter. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked gently, kneeling beside her chair. Catherine looked up at him, studying the face that had become so dear to her. The scars that told the story of his survival, the kind eyes that saw her true worth when others had turned away. "I'm thinking that I have a choice to make. A choice I never thought I'd have again." Dr. Morrison entered the office carrying his medical bag, ready to tend to Marcus's injuries from the fight with Bull Mackenzie. But he stopped short when he saw the expressions on everyone's faces. "Good news or bad news?" he asked cautiously. "Good news," Catherine replied, though her voice carried uncertainty. "Very good news. It seems I'm no longer Catherine Hayes, the disgraced runaway. I'm Catherine Morgan again, daughter of an innocent man and heir to everything my family once owned." The doctor began cleaning the cut on Marcus's forehead, while Catherine explained the contents of the telegrams. With each detail, the magnitude of her situation became clearer. She could return to Missouri with her head held high, resume her place in society, live the comfortable life she'd been born to expect. "So what's the problem?" Dr. Morrison asked, applying a bandage to Marcus's wound. "This sounds like everything you've wanted." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at Millbrook's dusty Main Street where children were playing hopscotch and Mrs. Henderson was hanging laundry on a line behind her house. "The problem is that going back means leaving everything I've built here. Leaving the school, the children who depend on me." She paused, her eyes finding Marcus's. "Leaving the people who've become my family." Marcus felt his heart crack like poorly tempered steel. He'd known this moment would come eventually, known that a woman like Catherine was too good for a place like Millbrook, too good for a man like him. But knowing it and experiencing it were two entirely different kinds of pain. "You have to go," he said quietly, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "This is your chance to have the life you deserve, the life you were meant to live." "What if the life I was meant to live isn't the one I was born to?" Catherine asked, her voice stronger now. "What if the person I've become here is more real than the person I was back there?" Mrs. Henderson burst through the office door without knocking, her face flushed with excitement. "Catherine, dear, we heard the wonderful news. The whole town's talking about it. Your father's name cleared. Those awful charges dropped. It's like a miracle." Behind her came Mr. Chun, young Billy's mother, and several other townspeople, all beaming with joy for Catherine's good fortune. But as they crowded into the small office, Marcus noticed something in their expressions. A sadness beneath the celebration. A recognition that this good news might mean saying goodbye to their beloved schoolteacher. "When will you be leaving?" Mrs. Henderson asked, trying to keep her voice cheerful despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Catherine looked around at the faces of people who had welcomed her when she was nobody, who had stood by her when danger threatened, who had become more than neighbors. They had become family. "I haven't decided yet if I'm leaving at all." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Catherine as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "But dear," Mrs. Henderson said gently, "surely you can't mean to stay here when you could have your old life back. Your father's position at the bank, your family's house, your place in society, everything that was stolen from you." "Those things were never stolen," Catherine said, her voice growing more certain with each word. "They were given away, traded for something far more valuable." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town she'd grown to love. "In Missouri, I was Thomas Morgan's daughter, defined by my father's success and my family's reputation. Here, I'm just Catherine, valued for what I do, not who I was born to be." Marcus watched her silhouette against the afternoon light, memorizing every detail because he was certain this would be one of their last moments together. No matter what she said now, the pull of her old life would eventually become too strong to resist. "The bank's offer won't wait forever," Sheriff Walsh said practically. "These kinds of opportunities don't come along twice." "No, they don't," Catherine agreed, turning back to face the room. "But neither do the chances to build something completely new. To become the person you're meant to be instead of the person others expect you to be." Dr. Morrison finished bandaging Marcus's injuries and closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. "Well, whatever you decide, you'd better decide soon. That federal marshal will be here within the week to collect Blackwood. and after that, the whole territory will know your story. You won't have the luxury of anonymity anymore. As the townspeople gradually filed out of the office, Catherine found herself alone with Marcus once again. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and impossible choices. "Tell me honestly," Catherine said, moving closer to him. "If I stay, will it be because you want me to, or because you think you don't deserve better?" Marcus looked up at her, his scarred face reflecting years of pain but also something newer. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of self-acceptance. "I think you deserve to choose your own path, whatever that might be. And I think I'm finally learning that my scars don't define my worth any more than your father's reputation defines yours." Outside the office window, the sun was beginning to set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new possibilities. But tonight, in the quiet of Sheriff Walsh's office, two people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to discover what kind of future they might build together. The telegram from Missouri lay forgotten on the desk, its promise of restored honor and social position no match for the deeper truths that had taken root in Kansas soil. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning in 1868, church bells rang across Millbrook's prairie landscape like music made of joy itself. Catherine Morgan, she'd reclaimed her real name after Richard Blackwood's conviction, stood before the mirror in Mrs. Henderson's spare room, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn during the long winter evenings. "You're absolutely radiant, dear," Mrs. Henderson fussed, pinning a small bouquet of wildflowers to Catherine's hair. "Marcus is the luckiest man in Kansas territory." Through the window, Catherine could see the townspeople gathering at the small church, their faces bright with celebration. She'd made her choice 6 months ago, declining the bank's offer and choosing to stay in Millbrook as both schoolteacher and Marcus's wife-to-be. The decision had surprised many, but it had felt as natural as breathing. The federal marshal had come and gone, taking Richard Blackwood back to Missouri to face justice for his crimes. The man who had terrorized Catherine for so long now sat in a prison cell, his stolen wealth returned to its rightful owners, his reputation destroyed by the very evidence Catherine had risked everything to preserve. "Are you nervous?" Mrs. Henderson asked, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from Catherine's dress. "Strangely, no," Catherine replied, surprised by her own calmness. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Meanwhile, across town at the blacksmith shop, Marcus stood before his own mirror, struggling with the collar of his new white shirt. His hands, so skilled at shaping iron and steel, seemed clumsy when dealing with delicate fabric and tiny buttons. "Hold still," Sheriff Walsh commanded, adjusting Marcus's necktie with the practiced patience of a man who'd raised 3 sons. "You're fidgeting worse than a schoolboy." Dr. Morrison chuckled from his seat on Marcus's workbench. "Never thought I'd see the day when our local blacksmith would be getting married, especially to the finest woman within 100 miles. Marcus caught sight of his reflection and paused, studying the face that had haunted him for 3 years. The surgery Dr. Morrison had performed last winter had reduced much of the worst scarring, but the damage was still visible, a permanent reminder of the fire that had taken his first family. "Having second thoughts?" Walsh asked, noticing Marcus's expression. "Not about marrying Catherine," Marcus replied firmly. "About whether she's making the right choice. She could have had anything: wealth, status, a place in high society. Instead, she's settling for a scarred blacksmith in a frontier town." "Settling?" Dr. Morrison laughed so hard he nearly fell off the workbench. "Son, have you seen the way that woman looks at you? She's not settling for anything. She's choosing exactly what she wants." Young Billy Peterson burst through the shop door, his deputy's badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Marcus, you ready? The whole town's waiting at the church, and Miss Catherine, Mrs. Morgan-to-be. She looks like an angel." Marcus took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders with the same determination he'd shown when facing Bull Mackenzie in the street. "I'm ready." The short walk to the church felt like the longest journey of Marcus's life. Townspeople lined the dusty street, calling out congratulations and well wishes. Children threw flower petals in his path, while their parents smiled and waved. These were the same people who had once crossed the street to avoid looking at his scarred face. Now they celebrated him as one of their own. Inside the church, every pew was packed with familiar faces. Mr. Chun sat beside the Patterson family, while the Morrison children fidgeted in their Sunday best. Even some of the neighboring farmers had made the trip to town for the wedding, drawn by stories of the schoolteacher and blacksmith who had faced down professional gunmen to protect their community. But Marcus saw none of them. His attention was focused entirely on Catherine, who stood at the altar waiting for him with a smile that could have lit up the darkest cave. She looked beautiful, of course, but more than that, she looked happy. Genuinely, completely happy in a way that took his breath away. As they joined hands before Pastor Williams, Marcus marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Two wounded souls who had found healing in each other's company. Two people who had learned that true worth comes not from society's approval, but from the courage to live authentically despite the scars life leaves behind. Do you, Marcus Thorne, take Catherine Morgan to be your lawfully wedded wife? Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. I do, Marcus replied, his voice steady and sure, for as long as we both shall live. And do you, Catherine Morgan, take Marcus Thorne to be your lawfully wedded husband? Catherine looked into Marcus's eyes, one clear and brown, the other clouded by old injuries, and saw not damage but strength. Not a man diminished by tragedy, but one made stronger by survival. I do, she said, her voice ringing with conviction, through whatever joys and sorrows may come. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very rafters. Marcus and Catherine kissed for the first time as a married couple, sealing their commitment before God and the community that had embraced them both. Later, at the reception in the town hall, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers and friends, a word he was still learning to use without fear. Sheriff Walsh raised a toast to the happy couple, while Dr. Morrison regaled the crowd with stories of Marcus's recovery and Catherine's brave stand against Richard Blackwood. Speech! Speech! Someone called from the back of the room, and soon the entire crowd was chanting for Marcus to say something. Marcus stood up slowly, his scarred face flushed with embarrassment but his eyes bright with joy. I'm not much of a speaker, he began, his voice carrying clearly despite his nervousness. But I want to thank all of you for something I never expected to have again, a place to belong. He looked down at Catherine, who sat beside him with tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks. 3 years ago, I thought my story was over. I believed the fire had taken everything worth having. But I learned something important from the woman who became my wife today. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts while the room listened in respectful silence. I learned that our scars don't define us. They're just proof that we survived something terrible and found the strength to keep going. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they lead us to exactly where we need to be. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Marcus and Catherine walked hand in hand to their new home, the small house behind the forge that they built together over the winter months. The Kansas wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. They had learned that love doesn't erase the past or magically heal all wounds. Instead, it gives people the courage to write new chapters in their stories. Chapters where scars become symbols of survival rather than shame, where two broken hearts can create something whole and beautiful together. In the end, Marcus Thorne and Catherine Morgan discovered that sanctuary isn't a place you find. It's something you build, one choice at a time, with people who see your true worth beyond the surface. And in that small frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business, they created their own private sanctuary built on acceptance, courage, and a love deep enough to reach what no one else could touch. As they stood together in their doorway, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Kansas sky, they knew their story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead, sorrows to face, joys to celebrate. But whatever came, they would meet it together. Two souls who had found their way home at last.